The presentation this evening is titled "In Defense of Parochialism, the Recovery of the AF Church Maps." And many of us are familiar, of course, with the church maps and have used them over the years for our own historical research, family history research, etc. The recovery of the church maps is a project which is being undertaken now and which the Historical Society is supporting, including through a small financial contribution. The Church Maps project is being sponsored by the Maritime Institute for Civil Society. And we're delighted this evening to have Paul Armstrong from the Institute present this topic. And the recovery of the maps and the genealogy related to them expresses the particularities of a different form of life now lying in a road not traveled. In this talk, Paul is going to discuss the significance of the maps and offer a defense for the value of parochialism. Paul is trained as an historical sociologist. He has held posts in economic development in municipalities in both Nova Scotia and Ontario. More recently, he was one of the organizers of the Irish Halifax Shirk Project, and for which he did research on the early mechanics library in Halifax. He did his doctorate at Dalhousie University with work on the intellectual genealogy of the Antigonish movement. His research is focused now on the theory of civil society. He has considerable experience with nonprofits at both the board and staff level, and holds offices currently as president of the Maritime Institute for Civil Society, as the chair for the Kith Observatory, Inc., and as treasurer for the Genealogical Association of Nova Scotia. Paul, we welcome you this evening, and we give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Lois. Thank you for the introduction. For the audience, I look forward to your comments and criticisms after the talk. It's the way we make things better. You know, find mistakes and improve them, and improve the way that we communicate. So Lois mentioned I'm an historical sociologist. So this talk may be somewhat less history and more sociology and philosophy than is customary for you, but I hope there'll be something of interest to each of you here tonight. Yeah, so I'm just going to get into the slide business itself. Okay, there, I think we've got that now. Okay. So I wanted to start by kind of dealing with the question about parochialism right off the bat to see if we can kind of get a grip on that and get it out of the way. The etymology for the word comes from of or relating to an ecclesiastical parish. But it kind of begs the question about what we mean by a parish. The parish that I'm, the understanding I'm following here is that it's a baptismal church territory. Abbot Aelred, in describing the successful preaching of St. Ninian among the Picts of Galloway, the crowding to his baptism of rich and poor, young and old, renouncing Satan and joining the army of the faithful, represents him as ordaining priests, consecrating bishops, and conferring the other dignities of ecclesiastical orders, and finally dividing the whole land into parishes. So dividing the whole land into parishes, again, it's a territorial definition. This was drawn from the Origins in 1851. the reference to Abbot Aelred. Aelred was a 12th century priest, and he's referring to Saint Ninian, who was 5th century. So the concept of a territorial district as the parish is very old indeed. Given the changes that have happened, we would probably use the word community now rather than parish. So my title could read In Defense of Community. So what I'm defending then is this contrast between parochialism and cosmopolitanism, or we might say between particularity and universality. So this is the introduction slide. It outlines the kind of sections that I'll be talking about. The number and letter in the top of the left corner there, there's a different one on each slide. So if you do have any questions about a specific slide, if you note the number and the letter, then that would help us find it. So the structure itself, initially, there's a considerable number of slides that are talking about the church maps themselves in the first half. And then in the second half, it's a discussion about the nature of historical explanation as being essentially parochial. The image we're looking at here is one of AF Church. So Ambrose Finson Church is his full name. I'm not going to be talking really too much about his biography itself, although it's quite interesting, and other people have discussed that in the not too distant past. So yeah, so section 2, maps as graphics. What is graphical representation? Graphical representations exhibit relations between ideas, data, information, or concepts in a visual map or diagram. Where a diagram exhibits conceptual relations, a visual map exhibits spatial relations. Alex Colville, a Nova Scotia boy, wrote a piece called My Favorite Painting. And it was about Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring. He had bought a reproduction of that painting in Europe just after the war. He was a war photographer and painter. And again in 1966 bought another copy of it. And it stood hanging over the fireplace of Alex and Rhoda throughout their lives. He wrote that Vermeer's subjects were scenes of ordinary life. A woman playing a lute, a woman writing a letter, attended by a maid, a geographer looking at a globe, a view of Delft. Delft was the city where Vermeer was born, worked, started a family, and died. The image here is a partial image of a piece called The Art of Painting by Vermeer, celebrated for its use of light and color in a complex and allegorical composition. But what I've done is blown up the map itself, that portion of the painting, to show that better. The map in the background was published by Claes Janszoon Vischer in 1636 and is reproduced here as a painting in exquisite detail by the artist. So it's so detailed, it's almost hard to believe that it was painted. Jonathan Jansen comments, of all of Vermeer's depictions of maps, the Vischer map of The Art of Painting remains the most ambitious in concept and a triumph of painting technique. The execution exudes confidence and displays an absolute control of means. The image conveys a sense of flow, of natural light as it skims left to right over the surface, lessening as it distances itself from the source of light, all the while revealing the brittle surface cracks, gentle undulations, and vertical folds formed after years of hanging. Vermeer was keenly interested in maps and used them in half a dozen of his paintings. James Wellew, who did his doctorate on Vermeer and cartography, gave a lecture in 2016 titled Vermeer's Mania for Maps. This interest in maps is not just a personal idiosyncrasy of Vermeer, though, but part of his social milieu. Consistent with their role as the leading trading nation in the 17th century, the Dutch led the world in cartography and publishing during this period. Ambrose Church, then, does not come to his map making as a new invention, but is already far down a long tradition of very capable cartography and beautiful graphical design. So the A.F. Church maps were developed between 1865 and 1888, one per county with insets. And what's unique about this, from my point of view, is that he provided precise geolocations for essentially every household in Nova Scotia. In the looking at the 1881 census, which is kind of partway through the period when he was doing his work, there were 74,154 dwellings with a population of 440,572 persons, with no indication of any ethnic bias. Business directories for each county were prepared, composed of advertisers. So, and you can see on the right a portion of one of the maps. So section 3, genealogy as text. What is text? The wording of anything written or printed, the structure formed by the words in their order, the very words, phrases, and sentences as written. Text can still show us relations, but it's harder to visualize and very difficult to convey spatial relations. So text in many ways is like MS-DOS, and where the maps are more like Windows, a graphical user interface. So I expect most of you are familiar with the 1980s and the different systems we had. So genealogy itself has kind of exploded in the last few decades. John D. Reed from Ottawa developed some data about genealogy related to the occurrence of the word genealogy in newspaper page publications. Unfortunately, there's nobody from the Maritimes, no paper from the Maritimes was used, but it gives some indication of the rise in interest that happened starting in the 80s and then increased beyond that even in the 1990s and 2000s and 2010s. This survey, these survey results were done by the Association for Canadian Studies in 2018. And they're asking about the basis of the interest in family history or ancestry. 39% were interested in learning more about their own family history. Another 11% were interested more generally in genealogy itself. Surprisingly, so that's 50% of the population there that were doing the interview. A surprisingly large amount, 23%, preferred not to answer. They had no information about why that was the case. So geogenealogy. I became interested and we started talking about it at the Institute in 2013 when we came across a project done by Ken Field and Linda Beale called Mapping the Emerald Isle, a genealogy of Irish surnames. What they had done was develop an inventory of names. I think it was for 1890 in Ireland, and the distribution of those names throughout the different counties and locations of the country, and the size of the names was is proportional to the frequency of the number of people in that area that had the name. So lots of fun and quite compelling, very fun and useful to do. They used Arcgis software. Arcgis is software that's been developed by a company called Esri. I believe they're the largest GIS software company in the world. They currently have about a 40% global market share. So subsequent to, kind of developing the bug, we became involved in building a prototype. And we did community experiments in Halifax, the old north end of Halifax, between Cogswell and North Street, Windsor and the water in 2014. Some work in Durham and Pictou County in 2015. New Ross in Lunenburg County in 2018. Heatherton in Antigonish County in 2019. The communities we were involved in were chosen for their differences. Durham, for instance, is a agricultural community, largely Protestant at that time, and in fact, almost all Presbyterian. Heatherton, on the other hand, farther to the east, is also an agricultural community at that time, almost entirely Roman Catholic. New Ross, forestry, and some small manufacturing like barrel making, and a mixed ethnicity and religious backgrounds. Halifax itself, commercial and trades. So chosen for different reasons. And the goal was to match the geolocations on the church map in those locations, in those communities, to the 1881 census. So the gold-colored dots you can see here are the points, the dwelling locations on the map that have been matched, and we're live. And this one that's in red is the particular one that was highlighted. On the left, you can see a panel with a number of records at that location, and the data that you're looking at is the information from the census record itself for that individual. Below that individual will be the other members of the household. The blue text that you're seeing is a link through to the handwritten enumerator sheets. So it's not uncommon for there to be an error in the transcription, and you're able to look at the handwriting itself to determine, what the word perhaps should be. So the prototype was set up for search options as well by the attributes by religion or occupation, ethnicity at the community level. So you're able to see the patterns of residential location using that as well. So following the building of the prototype, we formed a partnership with a number of other heritage groups in the province, West Hants Historical Society, East Hants Historical Society, the Heritage Association of Antigonish, and the Genealogical Association of Nova Scotia, located in Dartmouth and with interests in Halifax County. So we issued a public announcement, a call for original map lithographs. We'd already found in the prototype work that was going to be key, is actually getting copies of the maps. We ended up with 28 map donations, and we have copies of the maps for all 14 of the mainland counties. Halifax County, which was developed by Church in 1865, Hants County in 1871, Antigonish County in 1878, which are the 3 counties related to the groups that are involved. So they're the ones we're working on first. All of the maps have town insets and directories. The, the basic method which Church used to identify the people that lived in a location was there's a dot where the dwelling itself is, and in the empty space besides the dot, he just wrote in the name, J. Taylor in this case. And the problem is that in the town centers and the Halifax itself, the largest urban area, there simply wasn't enough room to write anything in. So what he did for the towns is create inset maps, small rectangular sections of that just relate to the town center, and they're blown up to a bigger scale, and the bigger scale provides enough room to write in names. So that's the method. In the case of Halifax County, Halifax was, quite densely populated even then. And Halifax County, as it happens, is the largest county physically, going down to Sherbrooke and over somewhat to the west there to St. Margaret's Bay. So the map was already very large. Halifax itself was densely populated in a fairly large area, and there simply wasn't enough room to blow up Halifax to make one of these inset maps. So it did require a different mechanism to match the geographical locations with the census information in the case of Halifax. The advertisers themselves, at one point we thought that the advertisers that are in the directories on each of the counties were basically like a listing, like a directory. But it seems clear that they are advertisers because there are examples where a commercial operation from one county is advertising in a second county as well. And we found that in Hants County, for instance. In August of this year, 2021, August 14th, we held a specialist workshop in Truro. And there were talks by 3 of the technical people that kind of mimicked the process of map recovery that we've been involved in. Julia Landry, who many of you will know, spoke about the physical map conservation, which she had done. Christian LaForest talked about the digitization work that he did on the physical maps that Julia Landry had completed. And Dave Raymond talked about the geomatics work that he did on the map digitizations that Christian had done. So it's sequential from one through to the other. The geomatics work that David did was georeferencing the maps, basically getting them lined up for latitude and longitude, and then geocoding the dwellings that are marked on the maps. And at that time, we announced the next phase where we would begin matching the 1881 census at the county level with the maps that we've done. So this image is a symbol of that kind of matching process where we're matching the geographic points on the map with the genealogical data that we're after. So GeoGen, geography and genealogy. So part 5, knowledge of kith. I want to add another organizing concept now, besides the discussion of parochialism and parishes, which we had at the beginning. I want to add a discussion about kith. So the contemporary meaning of, in terms of the contemporary meaning of kith, many of you will know it from kith and kin. Certainly my grandmother used kith and kin as a regular part of her conversation. In modern use, kith is often taken merely as a pleonastic phrase, that is, needlessly wordy or redundant, for kinsfolk, relatives, or family connections. So that is as a synonym. However, previously there were other meanings for kith, and the ones that are most attractive to me are number 3 and number 4. Number 3, the county or place that is known or familiar, one's native land, home, hence country, region, quarter, now obsolete. Or number 4, the persons who are known or familiar, taken collectively, one's friends, fellow countrymen or neighbors. Acquaintance, in later use, sometimes confused with kin, which we just talked about. So what's interesting here is that we've moved beyond the parish as a territory. We're also talking about the bonds of community, the relationships between the people that are there, one's friends, fellow countrymen and neighbors, acquaintances. So kith. So what do the maps and genealogy offer to each other? Well, genealogy, at least as I understand it, is a methodology and a means to family history. So from that point of view, it's a subordinate area of the larger historical field and historical discipline. Family history, though, is particularly the central building block for developing local history. The GeoGen project, therefore, is a new opening to knowledge of kith as local history in Nova Scotia. Joseph Amato is one of the leading local historians that we have, and expresses the significance in quite a beautiful way. The rewards of local history are first and foremost the recognition that human life turns on small individual places, and that in them one finds the genesis and formation of selves and individual families. So what are the possible particular historical applications in Nova Scotia that might be of value if we are able to move forward with the GeoGen project along the lines we're talking about? So I've identified 3. The one is socio-moral milieu. One promising avenue for historical analysis is the concept of socio-moral milieu, discussed by Hans Joas and Frank Adloff in the context of German civil society. Joas and Adloff argue that the concept emerged at the end of the 19th century, where it was used in social deterministic models, but has been used again recently by both Rainer Lepsius and Michael Vester. Lepsius uses it to denote social entities that are formed by the coincidence of several structural dimensions, like religion, regional tradition, economic situation, cultural orientation, and class-specific composition of intermediary groups. In short, it is possible to develop the contextuality that is necessary for deep historical analysis by locating the subject in 3 dimensions: temporal, social, political, spatial, and cultural, intellectual. The attributes of religion, regional tradition, and cultural orientation each have linguistic and ideological characteristics which allow for their connection to a framework of reflexivity, historicality, and agentiality. So, historical and economic growth. The data should also be helpful for understanding economic patterns. Recent work by Inwood and Kie and by Chernoff had begun the work of building an alternative explanation of maritime industrial decline. In a comparative study of US and Canadian manufacturers, Inwood and Kie conclude that what mattered was the producer's willingness to foster more fundamental determinants of growth: technical efficiency, appropriate input, and technology decisions, and the realization of scale economies. Using the same data, Chernoff suggests that regional agglomeration effects may have emerged as important determinants of growth during the late 19th century. The linking of the detailed population data developed from the AF church maps to the data developed in business and economic histories can provide insight into the validity of these hypotheses. Internal and external migration. So finally, this data provides a foundation for longitudinal work in migration. The historical narrative in Nova Scotia is dominated by the reality of internal and external migration. One clergyman, for example, ministering in a small eastern Nova Scotia community in the 1920s, admitted to issuing far more birth certificates for emigrants than for newborn babies. The Dominion Bureau of Statistics estimated that gross outmigration from the Maritimes to other Canadian provinces in the Boston States during the 50-year period between 1881 and 1931 was about 600,000 persons, with net outmigration of 470,000. As Patricia Thornton notes, this constituted some 50% of the population still present in 1931 at the end of the period. We do not have a good understanding of the internal migration patterns within the Maritimes or the composition of the difference between gross and net migration, and cannot therefore improve our understanding of the push factors involved in migration from ethnically and religiously distinct communities in Nova Scotia. So 3 possible specific applications that might be aided by the work that we're going to be doing here. But what does local history really amount to? There have been repeated criticisms that local history is petty, provincial, and parochial, and that local history misses, even obscures the underlying causal forces and fails its explanation. In fact, this is one of the, I would say, central to the argument that Ian Mackay has made in his 2019 paper on genealogy. So in the remainder of the talk, what I want to do is try to elucidate the structure of historical explanation and to argue that all history is essentially local. So section 6, the mid-century dispute about history. In the mid-20th century, the 1940s and 1950s, there was a very significant, very widespread confrontation between 2 views about historical explanation. The one which was rooted in the philosophy of science argued for a science explanation which dealt with cause and effect. The other competing explanation, rational explanation, rooted in the philosophy of history and typically used by historians of every sort. So means-end relations. The dispute was launched by Karl Hempel in 1942. And he had been a student of Hans Reichenbach, a member and a co-traveler with the logical empiricists. And Hempel, therefore, represents a scientific explanation. The method of empathetic understanding, he writes, or he wrote, I guess, does not in itself constitute an explanation. It rather is essentially a heuristic device. Its function is to suggest psychological hypotheses. But in history, as anywhere else in empirical science, the explanation of a phenomenon consists in subsuming it under general empirical laws. So this model of explanation came to be called covering law, the covering law model of an explanation. And you can see where it came from. He's talking about the empirical work being subsumed under general empirical laws. So the general empirical laws are covering the empirical work. Needless to say, this didn't sit well with many people. So sustained dispute involving many scholars over the next 20 years. William Drey was one of those disputants. He was a philosopher of history out of Ottawa, so a Canadian. And he wrote, not only is the covering law model not the universal type of explanation, it is not even the right sort of thing to be such a type. That it appeared plausible as the universal type to the philosophers concerned may indicate a preoccupation with the problems and procedures, not of history and everyday affairs, but of physics. And of course, that's how it would seem to many people too. In a 1995 survey article, the historian Richard Vann commented on Drey's argument. William Drey, inaugurating his effort to widen the concept of explanation and demote covering laws to only one species of the genus, noted in 1954 that when asked for an explanation of a certain event or state of affairs, the historian often responds by telling a story, and the narrative he offers sometimes explains in the how rather than the why sense. So Drey is trying to take a view of explanation which has different forms under it, where scientific explanation along the lines of Hempel would be one form, and the kind of historical explanation that he's arguing for would be another form. There might even be other more plural forms than that as well. So Elizabeth Anscombe. Anscombe was another intervener in the dispute. So she's writing, what distinguishes actions which are intentional from those which are not? The answer that I shall suggest is that they are the actions to which a certain sense of the question why is given application. The sense is, of course, that in which the answer, if positive, gives a reason for acting. So means end, a reason for acting. To call an action intentional is to say it is intentional under some description that we give or could give of it. So she's building on Ludwig Wittgenstein, who had written in the 30s and into the 40s and early 50s. The give a reason for acting is something that was shared very widely by most of the disputants in the dispute that was going on. But what Elizabeth is doing is extending that with the Wittgensteinian understanding of social behavior by saying intentional under some description. The phrase under some description is heavily laden. Anscombe is drawing on his Wittgenstein's understanding of the social as practices. The point that Anscombe and Hacking emphasize, Paul Roth explains, is that intentionality cannot be explicated in terms of a private mental state. Rather, as Hacking reads Anscombe, and I personally would add, as McIntyre also argues, references to intentional acts reflect socially sanctioned ways of describing what we or others sometimes do, how we characterize certain behaviors, what we see as moral. Reasons for an action, therefore, are both description and justification. In this regard, Anscombe is arguing that attributions of intentionality, the descriptions that people use, also become a study of the use of words in their sites. So not words in our heads, but words that are common, that we share and can use as justifications. So Donald Davidson. Donald Davidson writes a 1963 paper. So he is coming out of the analytical philosophy line. He's very familiar with Karl Hempel. He's done work with many of the kind of co-travelers of analytical philosophy in the United States. But he is also very aware at this point in 63, 20 years basically after Hempel's paper and his attack, he's very aware of the criticisms that it's received from dozens of people, dozens of scholars. So what he does in his own formulation is he accepts major elements of the criticism that have been made by Anscombe and by Drey and by many others. He proposes a formula that goes way beyond anything that Hempel was prepared to do. And that formula is pro-attitude plus belief results in action. A pro-attitude here could mean a desire or a moral value. He's not specifying in any detail. It's just like a positive attitude. I want that, or it's I value this as part of one of the elements in intentionality. What he's trying to do here is create a model, though, that's general, one that would be suitable for psychopaths as well as saints. So a desire could be a desire to rule the world, and a belief could be a belief that we're being injected with computer chips or tracking devices when we get our vaccine shots. So they don't have to be. There's no attempt here to, although it's seen here as a form of rational intentionality, it's not. It doesn't mean that it's a good, in some kind of normative sense. So that's kind of basically he's accepting major kind of criticisms and incorporating them into a new position. But there's a fly in the ointment. He writes, supposing we grant that reasons alone justify in explaining actions, but then something essential has certainly been left out, for a person can have a reason for an action and perform the action, and yet this reason not be the reason why he did it. Could be just a rationalization of why he, was fighting with somebody or whatever. Central to the relation between a reason and an action explains is the idea that the agent performed the action because he had the reason. So what the position is that he develops is that it's not enough for intentionality to be explained as a reason to act. It has to be actually a cause to act. It has to be the right reason. It has to be the reason that actually made them do it, the cause of their behavior, of their action. This view dominated the theory of action for the next 30 years. So section 7, the parochialism of historical explanation. At the same time that Donaldson is doing his work, Thomas Kuhn published his 1962 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and irrevocably changed the philosophy of science. The first sentence of the book reads, quote, history, if viewed as a repository for more than an anecdote or chronology, could produce a decisive transformation in the image of science by which we are now possessed, unquote. In 2012, on the 50th anniversary of the book's publication, Ian Hacking wrote, quote, Thomas Kuhn was out to change our understanding of the sciences, that is, of the activities that have enabled our species, for better or worse, to dominate the planet. He succeeded, end of quote. Arthur Danto, a leading theorist in the philosophy of history, writing in the 1995 Reprise, suggested that Kuhn advanced a view of history so powerful that rather than being an applied science, as Hempel holds history to be, history became the matrix for viewing all the sciences. It was as though science had been swallowed whole by one of its offspring, which, under the influence of Wittgenstein, N.R. Hansen, and Stephen Toulmin, not to mention Kuhn himself, had become the philosophical history of science. Danto goes on to say that he can think of very little in the philosophy of history from the middle 1960s to the present, when he's writing in 1995. Indeed, he said, to find someone actively working at any aspect of the philosophy of history would be almost to encounter an historically displaced person, like someone doing abstract expressionist canvases, as if the whole subsequent history of art had not taken place, or like encountering Japanese soldiers on some obscure atoll who never found out that the war had ended. So Thomas Kuhn made a change that was so significant that the history, and together with Donald Davidson's position, basically the history of the philosophy of history ends for 30 years. There were people working in history: Hayden White, Reinhard Koselleck, Kenton Squinner, Arthur Danto himself, Louis Mink, all who made contributions. And what I would say the contributions were, it was about narrativism. So what I want to do is discuss where we are now, the contemporary views about historical explanation, and where we've been to since Danto said, their work had stopped, because work resumed in the late 90s and into the 2000s. So I'm going to basically be talking a little bit about Roth's position from his 2020 book, The Philosophical Structure of Historical Explanation. And I'll just mention that the three other names here, Ian Hacking, Michael Friedman, Thomas Kuhn, they're interlocutors that Paul Roth is engaging with in the way that Quentin Skinner has talked about how we do contextual history, understanding what questions that people are engaging with and an author was engaging with, and who their interlocutors were. So these three people are Paul Roth's interlocutors. So what Roth's attempt to do is to validate historical explanations that are grounded in explanatory patterns. So he writes, synoptic judgment orders and structures the narrative, but the judgment cannot be supported or elucidated independently of the narrative that exhibits it. The narrative constitutes, in the specific sense, its own unique pattern of justificatory argument. So my sense, I have no evidence for this, but my sense is that many historians, this is their explanatory pattern, that this is their understanding of how historical explanation works, that it's a pattern within the narrative itself, within the narrative structure. So I'm not convinced that the narrative structure provides the kind of explanation that Roth thinks it does, or that is, I think, necessary to achieve. The argument basically is that the narrative structure has a beginning, a middle, and an end to the story, and that the connections between these elements, between the elements of the story, represent a unique pattern that is the explanation. What it looks like to me is that these are logical connections, not empirical connections. And so it's hard to tell what the difference would be between fiction and history. This is the same criticism as Donald Davidson was making in 1963. It's not enough to say that somebody has expressed this reason for action. You have to know that it is the reason that he acted, or she. So there is a second contender now for a position on the validity of historical explanations, which is grounded in contextualized reasons. And it's being argued for by Thomas Hubel. In the case of Hubel, his interlocutors are Daniel Hutto, Alistair McIntyre, Carsten Stuber. If you're familiar with any of the people here, you would see that they're not just different individuals, but they all also are different kinds, have quite different kinds of arguments and interests than the interlocutors for Roth. So kind of a difficult passage here. Hubel writes, the problem is to justify why one particular reason rather than another is specified as causally efficacious. The solution involves the supplementation of the reason given by narratives that contextualize it and provide additional criteria for justifying the causal claim. It is argued that narratives have a distinctive structure that can afford the justification of causal attributions without sui generis powers of narrative explanation having to be invoked. So the sui generis powers of narrative explanation that he's talking about are the kind of powers that Paul Roth is theorizing. And he's basically arguing that they're both surplus and not valid. So what does Hubel mean in this rather complex statement I just read? Hubel has argued that the narrative of action has a dual structure, with a narrative of intention and a narrative of setting, a structure which accounts for both the particular individual beliefs and aims of the individual on the one hand, and the constraints the individual faces in the social setting on the other. It is the narrative of setting which provides an empirical account necessary to justify the reason for action as a cause. So, quote, the temporal structure given by the goal-oriented nature of any behavior to be explained as action must be filled out in such explanations by content, beliefs and desires, intentions, doings, responses, and responses to responses, and so on, things that are determined by individual and social histories. So this explanatory model then, in my view, satisfies the remaining criticism of Donald Davidson and closes the loop on the mid-century dispute between scientific explanation and the rational explanation of history. Limitations of stylized facts. Stylized facts are much of social science, and it seems more and more of history, is using stylized facts as a basis for their rational explanations. It's not the case that this is inherently problematic, but stylized facts need a particular set of criteria before they can be justified. An unambiguous goal, knowledge of the means to accomplish the goal, repetition in many circumstances, low significance or costs. A well-defined problem would be buying milk on the way home from work. However, most historical work, and all historical work that I believe is interesting, consists of ill-defined action problems where the use of stylized facts is inappropriate. So I've kind of led you through the development of these explanatory structures and the issues related to them, and made this criticism about the problem with the stylized facts as the basis for doing history. And in conclusion, I want to kind of, I guess, propose or suggest two different images, quite different of the kind of implications that genealogy might have for doing local history and shedding light on our past. The one model is the one that's been presented by Ian Mackay. In his 2019 paper, The Morals of Genealogy, it's just such a use of stylized facts. His description of stylized behavior is crimped, pinched, and mean, and fails to illuminate or understand the culture which he seeks to describe. I would want to contrast this with something quite different. We find quite another kind of family history than Mackay portrays in the Depression Testament. Let Us Now Praise Famous Men by James Adjie and Walker Evans. It is a searing commentary on the rural poverty of sharecroppers in the southern US. Their success in doing so while continuing to show the human dignity of the tenants appears throughout the work. This achievement may perhaps have had something to do with Adjie's vocation as a poet and his struggle, as Andrew Hudgens has commented, to comprehend his place in God's vision. The title of the book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, was taken from Ecclesiasticus 44, and I'm going to read from that. Let us now praise famous men and our fathers that begat us. And some there be which have no memorial, who are perished as though they had never been, and are become as though they had never been born, and their children after them. But these were merciful men, whose righteousness hath not been forgotten. With their seed shall continually remain a good inheritance, and their children are within the covenant. Their seed standeth fast, and their children for their sakes. Their seed shall remain forever, and their glory shall not be blotted out. Their bodies are buried in peace, but their name liveth forevermore. So that perhaps is another image of why we might be conducting genealogy and trying to make a difference with the work we're doing. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks, Paul. That was really, really interesting. A lot of sociology. It's been a long time. So we're going to do about 15 minutes of question period. And if people are comfortable talking and unmuting themselves or their camera if they want, sometimes that works better for questions, or you can also send a message either to me, Sarah Hollett, or to everyone, whatever you're comfortable with. So do we have anybody who's really eager to have a first shot at it? No.
That was very good. I must have convinced you all.
Yeah, I think John Reed's got his camera on. He might be.
I do, yeah. No, very, very interesting. My question really, it's a very, very probably simplistic one, but in terms of the genealogy drawn from the church maps, one of the issues that I've faced in work in terms of gauging the significance of sport history in communities is just the very simple question that so many communities in the region have multiple people with the same surname.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering how in this project you deal with that difficulty.
Yeah, good question. It was the biggest problem we had was in Heatherton, where there are basically three families that, three names that are the McDonalds, the Frasers, and the Camerons, who are just about everybody in the community. And it's not, particularly perhaps in Catholic communities where there were large families, there are often multiple first names, the same as the second name.
Yeah.
So the biggest, the easiest job we had was in New Ross, which is multi-religious and multi-ethnic. And so although it had a founding with British soldiers, it's subsequently different ethnic groups populated the area. And it was they had like a 98% match there in the work that that they did in that area. There's another difference in the two communities, which I'm comparing. In the case of New Ross, they have a genealogy historical society that's been going since 1988. And you probably remember the name of the MLA for that area that was himself very keen on genealogy and history himself. In the case of Heatherton, Barkhouse, yeah, Ron Barkhouse. In the case of Heatherton, they had no historical experience or had not done any genealogical work in any collective way at all. And so the ability, the documents that are available and the kind of mastery of the genealogical tools it has proven to be a critical factor. You may not be aware that in recent years, the provincial government has made property online available to nonprofits that are doing historical work at no cost. And property online has proven to be a boon to developing detailed information, baptismal records, and birth and death records, cemetery information. All of these are helping identify the particular data that can contribute to resolving issues on the names. But I would say the central resource is community memory. The New Ross is more isolated geographically than Heatherton. Heatherton is about 9 miles east of Antigonish, and New Ross, is kind of insulated between Kentville on the one side and Chester on the other side at fairly considerable distance. So it seems that New Ross developed a knowledge about their community at an intensive level in a way that Heatherton didn't. And so there are going to be factors like that altogether, the kind of records that are available, the research tools that we have now that we can bring to bear, and the experience of the people in the area and the particularities of the community. So we're not expecting 100% match. If we can get up to 60 or 70%, at that point, we can release it publicly and we start to get people that are living in California and, Australia and England and Minnesota that are themselves descendants and have done work on their own lineages and can start to contribute to resolving the names that are still open, that are not resolved. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Good.
I see a few other cameras
Can I
on.
jump in here?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure who.
Thank you for making this public. Who designed or who drew the topographical features such as water courses and the roads on Church's map? Was it Church or somebody before him?
He was working with a team, but the person that knows the most about this is David Raymond, the geomatics fellow. David Raymond worked at the College of Geographic Sciences, well, now the Center of Geographic Sciences in Lawrencetown for a long time, 30 years maybe, and has done quite a bit of consulting with government bodies and private companies over the last 20 years since he retired from there. And he's advising that it was built on top of the map that was done in the mid 1800s. There's a difference in roads. like there are roads that are sketched in, they're kind of dotted lines, and they're wildly off. If you compare them to, we're now in a position to kind of compare at a pretty fine-grained level maps in the 3 counties I was talking about with, like the digital maps from Google, for instance, or and the dotted lines that they sketched in are kind of, they're just roughed in the zone. They're like not even within 2 miles, of being accurate. So, but the roads are typically are angled. That is, they're kind of little pieces of straight line that are, joined together. And where that exists, it's David is advising they were surveyed roads. They're building on surveyed information. No, I don't mean they necessarily surveyed themselves. The other thing that we've detected is that the level of detail seems to be much more detailed and higher quality as the population density gets better. So in the towns and nearby, the quality of the work seems to be better. The other thing I can mention on this track is about their own experience. Halifax County was done in 1865, and they're continuing to do this till 1988. And as a person might expect, they learn how to do it better. And so the geomatics work on the Halifax map required much greater kind of pushing and pulling and stretching the map to get it to fit the real world, like the real longitude and latitudes that exist, than it did for Antigonish, which was later, or for Hants County. So they learned how to do it better as they went. Halifax was their first try. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered everything that you were asking there, but that's kind of what I can do right off the bat.
Well, I'll contact David Raymond, but there seems to be quite a bit of congruency between Church's map and those compiled by the Geological Survey of Canada, notably Hugh Fletcher. And I'm noticing on the bottom of one of Fletcher's maps, it says compiled and drawn by Hugh Fletcher from plans made by the Admiralty, the Department of Crown Lands, Nova Scotia, and the Geological Survey. And I'm just have not come across any records of their work in surveying all the watercourses. I read in a geological report, a recent one done in the 60s or 70s, I think, that remarked on how accurate Fletcher's positioning of different features was on the maps, particularly watercourses. And it said that other maps, you were kind of vague about just which way they ran, but you could depend on Fletcher to be very accurate in positioning his streams. So there must have been some work even before these two men started adding their information to these maps as to the topographical positions and features.
Well, it's not to know. That's what I was trying to say at first, is that there are earlier Nova Scotia maps, and I'm forgetting the name of the one from the mid 1800s, but it's clear that he was building on top of that. The other piece of information I have is from Don Forbes. I don't know if you know him. He's with Heritage Trust and is a geographer. Was with the Geological Survey himself for many years, and he's told me that there are problems with the coastlines because of, it would, like, there's erosion that happens that's relatively severe, but that, there's altogether, they're pretty high quality maps that Church has done. So,
It's pretty impressive the way these, whoever did it, did the mapping. Some of these water courses involve long treks up rugged canyons and so on. And they didn't have lightweight backpacking equipment or GPSs
no,
in those days. Pretty impressive. But thanks for your explanation of this. Appreciate
Yeah.
it.
great, thanks.
I have certainly a question. It's just more of a thought. Like when you were talking about local history and community, this is more of like a present kind of connection, but it made me think a lot about people like moving to small places in Nova Scotia right now. And there's obviously like big things pushing that, like COVID and house prices. And we've seen obviously like huge, at least for me as a young person trying to buy a house, like huge life-changing, economic effects of that, like the housing market in Nova Scotia now. And I was just thinking about what you were, saying in defense of like local history, that it's not that it doesn't tell us anything and that it's useless, basically. But like I was just thinking, and like this is just a question or like just a thought, like thinking about like how we might look at the underlying. So we have the underlying causes, all these huge structural changes that are happening now. But like what about the people that are moving to these small places? Like how do you think we might see that local history in the future, like historical explanations of what's happened? And like what I'm just thinking of, like, like what happens to people that are coming from Toronto and moving to a small town in Nova Scotia and like mixing their rich, more wealthy sort of background potentially with
Well, I think
local middle class. Like what do you think, as like a sociology sort of perspective, what do you think, like how do you think we might look at that in like 50
there's definitely a positive side to it. I had occasion to be in Bridgewater area quite a bit there for a year or so, a few years ago. And at the art gallery in Bridgewater, a lot of the people that would turn out to the openings and things like that were people that had fairly recently moved to the area. Now, in part, that's, you want to make friends and, find people that you might be interested in knowing and things like that. So part of that may not be sustainable, but the other part is that they've, they're both because they perhaps have more money coming from other provinces and have been used to certain kinds of cultural things, that they can provide inputs into the community that have been harder to grow inside the community. So I think there are positives like that. I would say the biggest concern I would have from a sociology point of view is absorption rates. It's fairly easy to, if you're a family of 4 people and you let's say adopt another person, well, it's kind of 20%. It's a doable thing. But if you were if you had an inflow of another family, for instance, the struggle, it's a lot harder to absorb and kind of work out relations and so on. So I think there's perhaps some concern with absorption capacity, particularly where there seems to be something happening quite rapidly here and pushing up house prices for people that have lived here and haven't enjoyed high incomes in other locations. So yeah, that's what I could say about it.
Interesting. I'm always thinking about it. It's terrifying, but
Yeah.
it'd be interesting. Someone Lois has her hands up. There's just a question here in the chat that I'm not sure, maybe there might have been a direct message, but could you talk a bit more about other forms of stylized facts?
I didn't go very far on it was like one little slide at the end. I don't think I could really, I don't think I could really say anything more about that right now. There are issues about causality here that I didn't address and that are going to need more work on my side. So I see I see this understanding of historical explanation I'm presenting as representing a challenge to at least some elements of the social sciences and perhaps of history. Um, the but I'm not able to make a full case yet. So I'm sorry, that's all I can do on that.
A follow-up for that one.
Yeah.
Lois had her hand up there. Did you want to take your unmute yourself, Lois?
Why don't you ask Paul about John McLeod's comment?
Okay.
And then I'll come through with my own question, which is not directly related.
Okay. John's question is really, I think, really interesting. So yeah, I will definitely read that right now. So John McLeod's wondering about the collapse of local print media, and that until then, that point, you could say that the local weekly was the repository of the local narrative and the externalization of KISS knowledge. And John's wondering if social media might carry that function in the future.
There's a bit of discussion through the 90s. There was quite a bit of discussion about social capital and the extent to which, and related to that, kind of the shape of civil society and whether social media or kind of virtual groups that are in touch could adequately replace physical and territorial community. And the whole business with climate change seems to me to have some implications for that in the longer term, that it's going to become expensive to travel, like really expensive. So it might become less urgent, that kind of thing. But I had thought for a while, a couple years ago, I was thinking that it might be the nonprofits that take over some of the media functions that were done by local newspapers. It's certainly a possibility. It does appear that some of the larger newspapers are making enough money now, so it might still just be early times on how the local the viability of smaller than global news media might be something that's still evolving and emerging. So that's not clear. I don't think clear yet. But those would be the two options I would see for the options for kind of local history and local communications is either we're still early enough in the road that we haven't quite figured out how to do it yet at the local level, or that it, whatever, in the event that it's not viable, that nonprofits will start to take it over and provide functions. So it's pretty hard to support identity formation and solidarity, community solidarity, without better communications at the local level. That's the best I can do, John.
Yeah, your successors, sociologists, will wonder why some stuff, like why people are constantly sharing photos of cats, and there's all kinds of other stuff that's going to happen too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Lois, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I'm just a little curious, Paul. Some of the underpinnings of your perspective remind me of Michel Foucault and the Marxists, his Marxist approach in the 70s. And the argument then, which is similar to yours, between microhistory and macrohistory, particularly within the French historical community. Do you see synergies, parallel paths here, or intersections? Could you comment on that briefly?
Yeah, I've not been a fan of Foucault myself, but Roth, that I was mentioning, has a chapter about Ian Hacking's work, and Ian Hacking was has been influenced by Foucault. I've read a lot of Hacking. I like him quite a bit, and the chapter in Roth's book was like totally outstanding, and it helped me appreciate better what hacking is really all about, and so the there are overlaps with Foucault and Wittgenstein, that, you know, his interest in discourse is part of that, and so I may have to invest more in Foucault than I have. I read The Order of Things, which I found turgid and kind of dispiriting, but I haven't spent a lot of time with him. A wag once said the post-structuralists are you know, disappointed Marxists, and so it's I'm not strongly attracted to Foucault, and his concerns with power are problematic for me. So I was more influenced by Peter Winch and that strand early on, and the same criticism has been labeled at Peter Winch, you know, over the years, that it was kind of on the idealistic end, and no insufficient engagement with issues of power. But yeah, that's all I can really say about Foucault. I'm prepared to read more of him, but I so far have found it fairly distasteful.
Thank you for that perspective, though, Paul. And it detracts nothing from the fact that the project that the Institute is taking on is a very powerful one, a useful one, and we hope it will make a difference in the
Thank
community.
you. Yeah, thanks very much. Appreciate that.
Is there any other last minute questions? We nearing the end of our time together? Oh, Leo, I also had a follow-up comment to the social media question, that social media is lost in scattered shot full of ideological agendas, not a hope in hell that it can shape any informed narratives. The loss of community weeklies is deeply troublesome.
Yes.
Agree. But I think there'll still be some kind of something that can be brought out of social media years down the road. But maybe it's just because I'm a millennial.
Well, it's been a pleasure being with you here today, and look forward to the lectures that are coming up. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul, very much. It's been provocative and interesting. presentation on many levels. And I thank everyone who has contributed to the evening, and Sarah Hollett for leading the discussion period. And I think that brings us to the adjournment. I don't believe there's any further business, but Sarah, would you like to remind people what the next lecture is?
Yes. I don't know the title offhand, but it's Steve Schwingemer is the next lecture on. Is it not on the website yet? Oh no.
I can step in here. I looked.
Do you have it right in
earlier
front of you?
today.
I don't have it in front of me.
17th of November, we will look forward to seeing many people again, maybe in person. It's Steve Schwingemer, and he is talking on Railroaded, the creation of immigration facilities in Halifax, 1889 to 1928, which I think means he is going to tell us why there is a passenger coach outside the National Museum of Immigration. It will be a good story, I'm sure. So with that, I think we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you again on the 17th of November.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.